blood pounds in her ears, drowning the memory of polite billionaire applause. A cheap hand-carved wooden puzzle box sits on the marble kitchen island. Hours ago, she publicly laughed at the hollow-eyed man who offered it. Now she realizes that splintered wood holds the foundation of her entire empire. The air inside the grand ballroom of the St. Regis tasted like dry ice-roasted duck and the collective anxiety of 300 investors trying to pretend they were friends. Claire Hayes stood near the ice sculpture of the Aegis Data logo, her facial muscles locked in a rictus of gracious hostility. Her feet were screaming. The patent leather of her 6-inch heels felt like a pair of vices, slowly crushing her metatarsals, but taking them off was out of the question. You didn't oversee a $70 billion data security empire in flats. You stood taller than the men who wanted to buy you out, and you smiled while you bled. Incredible quarter, Claire. A venture capitalist named Greg droned, swirling his gin until the ice clinked against the crystal. He smelled heavily of juniper and expensive arrogance. Though I have to ask with the anniversary, here, do you ever miss the early days? The garage startup vibe. Claire took a sip of her sparkling water. It was room temperature and flat. We didn't have a garage, Greg. We had a windowless basement under a laundromat that smelled like bleach and rat poison. I miss it the way I miss having my wisdom teeth pulled. Greg barked a laugh, slapping his knee, as if she had told a brilliant joke. Claire merely tilted her head, her gaze drifting over his shoulder. That was when she saw him. He was a glitch in the meticulously coded environment of the gala. While the room was a sea of bespoke Tom Ford and Vera Wang, this man wore a suit that was aggressively out of style. The lapels were too wide. The fabric across the shoulders carried the unmistakable greasy sheen of cheap polyester that had been ironed too many times. He moved with a hesitant, jerky momentum, dodging waiters carrying trays of caviar-topped blinis. Security should have stopped him at the velvet ropes, but somehow he had slipped through the blind spots. Claire's head of security, a broad-shouldered ex-Marine named Miller, finally spotted the anomaly and began moving through the crowd, a hand pressing into his earpiece. But the man in the shiny suit was already standing in front of Claire. Up close, the contrast was even harsher. The man's face was deeply lined, his skin holding a greyish pallor that suggested bad lighting and chronic exhaustion. He smelled sharply of industrial hand soap and old, stale coffee, a scent that instantly dragged Claire back to the bleakest days of her 20s. His hands, clutching a small, roughly wrapped object, were intensely calloused. A faint tremor vibrated through his left index finger. "Ms. Hayes," he said. His voice was gravelly quiet, lacking any of the forced projection the tech bros used when they pitched her. "Sir, you need to step back," Miller rumbled, appearing at the man's elbow. Miller's hand hovered just inches from the stranger's bicep, ready to apply compliance. Claire held up a single manicured finger. The cameras from the business press were only 20 feet away. A physical altercation would trend on Twitter before the dessert course was served. "It's fine, Miller. Give us a moment." She turned her cool, perfectly symmetric smile on the intruder. "Can I help you?" "I'm Thomas," he said. He didn't offer a last name. He didn't offer to shake her hand. Instead, he looked at her. It wasn't the look of a sycophant, nor was it the hungry stare of a competitor. It was a heavy, exhausted sort of pity. It made the hair on the back of Claire's neck stand up. "Right." "Thomas," Claire said, keeping her voice light performing for the nearby eavesdroppers. "Are you a shareholder, a fan of our encryption protocols?" Thomas looked down at the object in his hands. It was a small box wrapped in crinkled brown paper and sealed with an obscene amount of standard desk tape. "I brought this for the 10-year anniversary." He thrust it toward her. "From the basement days." Claire didn't reach for it. She let it hang in the space between them for a long, agonizing second. Finally she took it, her fingers brushing the coarse paper. It weighed almost nothing. She picked at the edge of the tape with her thumbnail, peeling the cheap wrapping back. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden box. It was clumsy work, the wood splintered at the hinges, stained an uneven muddy brown. Claire opened the brass latch. Resting on a bed of cheap cotton balls was an unbranded scratched plastic thumb drive. Claire stared at it. The absurdity of it bubbled up in her chest. She had spent the morning rejecting a $3 billion merger from a European conglomerate, and now a man in a polyester suit was handing her a $5 flash drive in a splintered box. A laugh escaped her. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not intentionally, but it was sharp, sudden, and utterly dismissive. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent a decade building an armor of absolute superiority. "Is this a resume, Thomas?" Claire asked, her tone dropping, its diplomatic warmth freezing over. Because HR handles applications, and they generally prefer PDFs to whatever this is. Thomas didn't flinch. The tremor in his finger stopped. "It's not a resume," he said quietly. "It's context for your anniversary." Claire snapped the wooden lid shut. The dry clack echoed loudly in the small circle of silence that had formed around them. She shoved the box into Miller's chest. "Take this to the security desk. Run a full malware sweep on it before it goes into the incinerator." She looked back at Thomas, her patience evaporating. "Thank you for the gift, Thomas. Miller will show you to the exit. Please take a complimentary gift bag on your way out. They have very nice mints." She turned her back on him. Before he could speak, instantly engaging a terrified-looking junior analyst in a conversation about server cooling efficiency. She didn't look back to watch Miller escort the man away. But for the rest of the night, no matter how much scotch she drank, Claire couldn't wash the phantom smell of industrial soap and old coffee out of her nose. At 2:14 a.m., the penthouse was completely silent, save for the low, perfectly calibrated hum of the climate control system. Claire stood in her kitchen. The marble floor was freezing against her bare feet, a sensation she usually welcomed to ground herself after the sensory overload of a gala. Tonight it just made her feel fragile. She poured 3 fingers of Lagavulin into a heavy crystal tumbler. She didn't bother with ice. The scotch hit her stomach like a hot stone, radiating a chemical heat that did nothing to settle her nerves. Sitting alone on the vast expanse of the kitchen island was the cheap wooden box. Miller hadn't incinerated it. He was a creature of protocol. He had run it through the isolated air-gapped security rig, found no explosive residue and no executable malware, and had left it in the cleared personal items bin, which her assistant had dutifully transferred to her apartment. Claire glared at it. She hated things that were out of place. Her apartment was a temple of minimalist Italian design, all sleek lines, grey leather and brushed steel. The splintered wooden box looked like an infection sitting on her counter. She wanted to throw it away. She walked to the edge of the island, picked up the box, and hovered it over the steel basin of the trash chute. Context. Thomas's voice echoed in her head, rough and quiet. And that look, that damning, tired pity. "Damn it," Claire whispered into the empty room. She yanked her hand back, carrying the box to the long dining table. She opened her briefcase and pulled out her burner, a completely isolated, stripped-down laptop she used strictly for analyzing suspicious external data. It had no network card, no wireless capabilities. She opened the wooden box, pulled out the scratched plastic thumb drive, and shoved it into the USB port. The screen blinked. A single folder appeared on the desktop. Folder name Aegis_Genesis. Claire clicked it. Inside were dozens of raw text files, a few blurry JPEGs, and a folder labeled com_logs. She opened the first text file. It was a wall of code. Claire wasn't just a boardroom CEO. She had started as a programmer. She could read Python and C++ as fluently as English. Her eyes darted across the lines, parsing the syntax, the loops, the logic gates. Her breath hitched. She scrolled down faster now, the reflection of the white screen glowing against her pale face. It was the Aegis algorithm. It was the proprietary hyper-efficient compression and encryption loop that allowed their servers to process data 40% faster than any competitor on Earth. It was the holy grail that had secured their first $100 million valuation. But this wasn't the sanitized patented code sitting in her company's vault. This was raw. It was messy. It was full of developer notes and commented out dead ends, and the timestamps. Claire stared at the creation date on the file properties. October 14th, 2012. No, Claire said aloud. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. That's impossible. She and her late co-founder Richard hadn't written the Aegis algorithm until the spring of 2014. That was the company mythology. They had spent 3 sleepless weeks in that bleach-scented basement, hopped up on Adderall coding, until their fingers bled, finally cracking the loop together. But the file in front of her was dated 2 years prior. Her hands were shaking. She opened the folder labeled com_logs. It contained a series of exported email threads. From t.wright@pen-net.edu to r.vance@pen-net.edu. Date November 3rd, 2012. Rich, I finally smoothed out the compression loop. The latency is practically 0 now. I've attached the final build. Let me know what Professor Higgins thinks. Also let me know if you can cover rent this month. Chloe has another fever. I had to miss my shift at the garage. Claire felt a cold sweat prickle across her forehead. Richard, her brilliant, charismatic co-founder, who had died in a Maserati wrapped around a redwood tree 4 years ago. He had brought the breakthrough to her in 2014, claiming it was a sudden stroke of genius he'd had in the shower. She kept reading. The emails jumped forward in time. From t.wright@gmail.com to richard@aegisdata.com. Date May 12th, 2015. Richard, I saw the Wired article. That's my loop. You changed the variable names and slapped a patent on it, but it's my architecture. You know it is. I wouldn't even care, Rich, I really wouldn't. But Sarah's medical bills are drowning us. Chloe needs a stable place to live. I just need a fraction of what you are making off it. 10,000, that's all I'm asking. Please don't make me get a lawyer. I don't have the energy. From richard@aegisdata.com to t.wright@gmail.com. Date May 14th, 2015. Tommy Buddy. Good to hear from you. Sorry about Sarah. I think you're confused about the IP. The core mechanics of Aegis are entirely proprietary, built in-house. But we go way back. I'm wiring $2,500 to your old account as a personal gift. Take care of the kid. P.S. If you try to sue me with a public defender, my legal team will counter-sue for defamation and take whatever you have left. Be smart. Claire slammed the laptop shut. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet penthouse. She stumbled backward, her hip bruising against the sharp corner of the dining table. She grabbed her scotch and drank the remaining liquor in one violent swallow. It didn't help. She felt nauseous. She didn't feel a sudden, cinematic wave of empathy for the poor, single dad. Empathy was a luxury for people who hadn't spent a decade fighting off corporate vultures, sexism, and hostile takeovers. Instead, she felt a hot, venomous rage. She was furious at Richard. Her dead partner had lied to her, had built their entire empire on stolen property, making her an unwitting accomplice to theft. But underneath that ugly and dark, she was furious at Thomas. Why hadn't he fought harder? Why did he just take the $2,500 and disappear? Why was he invading her perfect, sterile life now, 10 years later, to hand her a piece of splintered wood that turned her entire identity into a lie? Claire gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. Her makeup was still flawless. Her hair was still perfectly styled. But the woman looking back felt like a fraud. Every magazine cover, every Forbes ranking, every brutal decision she had made justifying her wealth because she had built it from the ground up, all of it rested on the shoulders of a man she had laughed at and sent to the buffet. She looked back at the laptop. The urge to toss the computer, the drive, and the wooden box into the incinerator was overwhelming. She could delete it. No one would ever know. She was Claire Hayes. She controlled the narrative. But as she stepped toward the table, she noticed something she had missed. Inside the wooden box, wedged beneath the cotton balls, was a small, folded piece of lined notebook paper. Claire picked it up. Her hands were still trembling as she unfolded it. It was a drawing done in faded crayon of a little girl holding hands with a man. At the top, written in a child's clumsy, oversized letters, it read, "Daddy's Magic Box." On the back of the paper, written in Thomas's cramped handwriting, was a single sentence. "I didn't want your money then, and I don't want it now. I just wanted you to know whose shoulders you're standing on before you sell them." Claire sank into the nearest chair, the paper fluttering to the floor as the silence of the penthouse finally crushed her. The morning smelled of ozone and impending rain. Claire hadn't slept. She had spent the dark hours tracing the digital ghosts of Thomas Wright, her private investigator, a man who usually charged $2,000 an hour to bury corporate infidelity, had found Thomas's footprint in less than 40 minutes. It was pathetically small. No offshore accounts, no shell companies. Just an address in a crumbling industrial zone of Newark, an overdue water bill, and an employment record at a marine salvage and repair yard. Claire stepped out of her town car. The air here was heavy with the stench of diesel fuel and rotting kelp from the nearby docks. Her Louboutins crunched on gravel mixed with shattered auto glass. She felt absurd in her tailored charcoal trench coat, a creature of high finance, dropped into a landscape of rust. The repair shop was a corrugated metal shed, leaning dangerously to the left. The front door was propped open with a cracked cinder block. Claire walked in. The interior was a dim cavern of shelving units, piled high with gutted radios, tangled spools of copper wire, and corroded engine blocks. The sharp, acrid scent of melting rosin-core solder burned the back of her throat. Thomas sat hunched over a workbench under a buzzing fluorescent tube. He was wearing faded denim and a heavy canvas jacket, a soldering iron held steady in his right hand. He was repairing the frayed guts of a tactical marine transmitter. He didn't look up when her heels clicked against the concrete floor. "Shop's closed for retail. Drop-offs go in the blue bin." "I don't have a drop-off," Claire said. Thomas paused. He set the soldering iron down in its cradle, the metal pinging softly as it cooled. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag and finally turned to look at her. In the harsh blue-white light of the shop, the exhaustion etched into his face was even more pronounced. He looked like a man who had been walking uphill for 10 years. "Ms. Hayes," he said. His voice was flat. "You didn't need to come here. I meant what I wrote." Claire pulled a sealed envelope from her pocket. The heavy cream-colored cardstock felt grotesque in this grimy shed. She placed it on the workbench, right next to a scattered pile of transistors. "There's a cashier's check in there for $7 million, Claire said. Her voice was steady, practiced. "It's drawn from my personal accounts. completely untraceable to Aegis, tax-free. You take it, you put your daughter through whatever school she wants, and you sign a non-disclosure agreement stating that the code on that drive never existed. Thomas stared at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even lean away from it. He just looked at it as if it were a dead insect. "You think I'm holding you hostage?" he said softly. "I think you're a man who got screwed by my dead partner," Claire corrected, crossing her arms to ward off the damp cold of the shed. "And I think you want a correction. This is the correction. Take the money, Thomas." A bitter, humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You don't get it. You really don't." He picked up a small fried circuit board, rolling it between his calloused fingers. "I didn't write that compression logic in a cushy dorm room. I wrote the base architecture in a dust-choked FOB outside of Helmand province." Claire frowned, the corporate script in her head abruptly failing. "Afghanistan. Signals intelligence." Thomas said, his gaze dropping back to the workbench. "We were running tactical comms for medevac units. The telemetry files were too heavy. By the time the data transmitted over the mountains, guys were bleeding out, waiting for air support. So I built a loop, a way to strip the fat off the data and punch it through the static. It wasn't about making $1 billion. It was about keeping an 18-year-old kid from bleeding to death in the dirt." He tossed the circuit board onto the table. It clattered sharply. "When I got out, I tried to adapt it for commercial use. Richard was my neighbor. He saw what it could do, and while I was working graveyard shifts at a dispatch center, holding my wife's hand through aggressive chemo, he stole the patent. He didn't just take my code, Claire. He took my agency. He took the safety I was supposed to give my daughter." Thomas looked up. His eyes were hard, boring into hers. $7 million doesn't give me that back. It just makes me complicit in the lie. You keep your check, Ms. Hayes. Sell your company. Go back to your galas. I just needed you to know exactly what you're selling." Claire stood frozen. The ambient noise of the salvage yard, the groan of heavy machinery, the distant blast of a ship's horn seemed to amplify, pressing against her eardrums. For the first time in her professional life, she had no counteroffer. She looked at the cream envelope resting in the grease. She reached out, snatched it back, and walked out into the rain without another word. The boardroom on the 55th floor of the Aegis Tower smelled of lemon polish and expensive espresso. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping, godlike view of the Manhattan skyline, a landscape of concrete and glass that Claire had conquered. 12 men and 3 women sat around the massive mahogany table. At the far end sat the legal team from the European conglomerate, adjusting their silk ties. Between them lay the merger agreement. $3.4 billion. Greg, the venture capitalist from the gala, leaned back in his plush leather chair, radiating predatory excitement. "So, Claire, the ink is ready. We sign this, and we all become very, very comfortable." Claire sat at the head of the table. A Mont Blanc fountain pen rested between her fingers. Its weight was familiar, comforting. All she had to do was press the nib to the thick paper sign her name in 3 places. And the nightmare would be over. She would have a golden parachute so large it would blot out the sun. She could buy a private island. She could forget the smell of rosine solder. She looked at the signature line. Her stomach violently rebelled. A cold sweat broke out along her hairline. She squeezed her eyes shut, and suddenly the mahogany table was gone. She saw the splintered wooden puzzle box. She saw the grease on Thomas's jacket. She heard the tremor in his voice when he talked about medevac choppers and a daughter he couldn't protect. She was a ruthless businesswoman. She had fired friends. She had gutted competitors. But she had always believed she was a builder. If she signed this paper, she wasn't a builder. She was just a fence peddling stolen goods. Claire opened her eyes. She set the Mont Blanc pen down. It clicked sharply against the glass table. "I can't sign this," Claire said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the low murmur of the room like a scalpel. Greg chuckled a nervous, tight sound. "Claire, we've negotiated the severance package. If it's about the board seats—" "It's not about the board seats," Claire interrupted. She stood up. Her legs felt hollow, but her posture was rigid. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. She tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid, coming to a rest against the merger documents. "What is that?" the lead European counsel asked, his brow furrowing. "That," Claire said, her pulse hammering against her ribs, "is the foundational architecture of the Aegis algorithm, complete with time-stamped developer logs, military service records and email correspondence predating our company's incorporation by 2 years." The room went dead silent. The air seemed to curdle. Claire, her own lead counsel, warned, his tone dropping an octave. "What are you doing?" "I am officially informing our buyers and our board that Aegis Data does not possess clear title to our core intellectual property," Claire said. The words tasted like ash. With every syllable, she was setting fire to $100 million of her own net worth. "My late partner, Richard, acquired the core compression logic through theft." Greg slammed his hands on the table. "Are you out of your mind? You're tanking the deal. You're tanking the stock. We will sue you into oblivion." "Get in line." Claire snapped the corporate veneer, finally cracking, revealing the raw, adrenaline-fueled anger underneath. She wasn't an angel. She was a woman tearing down a corrupted house with her bare hands. "The SEC will be here by tomorrow. The original author of the code is a man named Thomas Wright. I have already initiated the legal transfer of the patent rights back to his name, effective an hour ago. Whatever scraps are left of this company after the litigation settles, he owns." She didn't wait for the screaming to start. She turned her back on the furious executives, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the heavy glass doors. "You're finished in this industry, Claire," Greg bellowed behind her, his voice cracking with panic. "You're dead!" Claire pushed through the doors, stepping out into the hushed, carpeted hallway. Her phone was already buzzing frantically in her pocket. The stock ticker in the lobby would be a bloodbath within the hour. Her reputation as the untouchable ice queen of tech was irreparably shattered. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the street 55 stories below. The traffic looked like tiny, slow-moving insects. Her chest heaved. She was terrified. She was practically unemployed, facing years of brutal depositions, and her bank accounts were about to be frozen by furious shareholders. Yet as she pressed her forehead against the cool glass, listening to the muffled chaos erupting in the boardroom behind her, Claire realized something strange. Her shoulders dropped. The vice-like grip in her jaw relaxed. For the first time in 10 years, she could breathe. If this story hit a nerve, you're in the right place. We explore the raw, unpolished edges of human nature, where real power isn't about the money you hold, but the truths you refuse to bury. What would you have done in Claire's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button to support the channel, and make sure to subscribe for more deeply grounded, dramatic storytelling every single week. See you in the next one.